Well, hello and welcome to this launch event for the new book, Faith, Nationalism, and the Future of Liberal Democracy. Thank you so much for joining us today for a conversation on this timely and insightful new book. My name is Judd Birdsall, and I serve as a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. At the Berkeley Center, I lead the project of the Transatlantic Policy Network on Religion and Diplomacy, the TPNRD. And the TPNRD is a forum of diplomats from North America and Europe who collaborate on issues related to faith and foreign policy. And this whole complex interplay between religion and populist nationalism has been a key area of concern and focus for us over the past several years. And so we're delighted to be able to host this webinar today and to engage some of the top scholars in the field who have written this new book. And I'm delighted to introduce them now. The co-authors of Faith, Nationalism, and the Future of Liberal Democracy that we have with us on the call today are David Elcott, Colt Anderson, and Tobias Kremer. We're also very pleased to have Jocelyn Cesari with us as a respondent. David Elcott is the Henry and Marilyn Taub Professor of Practice in Public Service and Leadership at New York University's Wagner School of Public Service, where he also directs the Advocacy and Political Action specialization. Colt Anderson is a church historian and theologian at Fordham University's Graduate School of Religion and Religious Education. Tobias Kremer is a former colleague of mine at Cambridge University, where he was a graduate research associate at the Cambridge Institute on Religion and International Studies during his PhD days. And now he's a junior research fellow at Pembroke College, Oxford. He was also a visiting research fellow at the Berkeley Center back in 2019. And Jocelyn Cesari holds the chair of religion and politics and is director of research at the Edward Cadbury Center for the Public Understanding of Religion at the University of Birmingham in England. She's also a visiting professor of religion, violence, and peace building at Harvard Divinity School, and a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center and an associate professor at Georgetown University. A very warm welcome to all of our panelists and also to all of our audience members for joining us today. In terms of format, we'll have all of our co-authors speak about the book and about the chapters they contributed, and then we'll have Jocelyn offer some reflections in response. Then we'll open things up for conversation with the audience. You can type your question at any time by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please do be as brief as you can be in phrasing your questions so we can get through as many questions as possible. And you're welcome to let us know your country and your institutional affiliation if you like. This event is being recorded, and a recording of the event will be posted on our website within the next few days, and you'll receive an email with a link to that recording once it's live. Well, thanks and congratulations to all of our authors on this new publication. We're delighted to learn about the book and to discuss it with you. I thought we'd start with Professor David Elcott. David, could you just give us an overview of the book, its main premise, and particularly how the book came together in this particular constellation of authors that contributed to the book?
I've spent years traveling the world, working with communities, mainly on advocacy and organizing, but always with faith communities and ethnic communities. And what I realized, particularly, let's focus for the moment on the United States, that having spent time in the South, in churches, evangelical churches, Catholic churches, there seemed to be a huge misapprehension about faith and politics, that the religious right, so to speak, the nationalist right, are irrational, that they're against their own best interests, certainly their economic interests. And that's, of course, the view that comes from academics and comes from the global elite, all of us, probably everybody who is at this webinar, who feels so comfortable in this global world of which we're a part. What I realized was that people are voting, they're engaging, they're passionate in the world, not simply about their economic interest, or even their power, but the feelings of loss that the average citizen in liberal democracy is facing, the sense that the world is passing them by. Arlie Hochschild has a wonderful image she gives us of these people feeling they've stood patiently in line, waiting their turn to get all the benefits of liberal democracy. And all these other people are jumping in front of them. In some countries, it's Jews. In other countries, it's African Americans or Blacks. In other countries, it's some other minority. Or even worse, it's illegal immigrants who are coming into my country. And this sense of I'm being lost, my culture, my world is being lost. So this revolt is real, and it is both nationalist on one side. I'm defending my culture and my country. On the other side, it's othering. It's saying those people don't belong. Or if they're here, they're a minority. They shouldn't be the ones making decisions. Of course, liberal democracy is grounded on protecting individual rights, human rights, civil rights. And so that focus on the other is a critical piece of liberal democracy. So here we have this tension. Let me read, though, from Viktor Orban. I'll read a quick quote that pushes the premise of this book. He says there's an alternative to liberal democracy. In his case, in Hungary, it's called Christian democracy. It's not about defending religious articles of faith, but rather to protect the ways of life springing from Christian culture. This is the fundamental premise of the book, that it's not about religion. And that's the confusion I think often that political scientists have. They'll talk about Catholics or Hindus or Buddhists or Jews or Protestants, but it's really about religious identity. So often in many places we find that the more religious, the more church-going you are, the less likely you would support Donald Trump. The more you are concerned about loss, you will use your religious identity. That becomes more crucial because that identity is saying about who's authentic and who belongs. And so what we began to do was study exactly what it is about religious identity that's so powerful, and how is it that leaders around the world can use it, even those who are not in any way observant. If you think about Donald Trump in America, or you think about Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, these are not faithful people. These are not church-going or synagogue or mosque-going people. And yet they will use the language of religious authenticity to gain power and to separate themselves, the real authentic Germans or Poles or Americans or Israelis, from those other folks that don't really belong. So the premise of the book was finding that and then saying, wait a moment, if that's true, even in places where people aren't going to church, they're not going to synagogue, faith still matters. The language of religion still matters within the culture. And so we need to nurture a theology of democracy in whatever religion it is, a theology of democracy, because the assault on the institutions of liberal democracy, our courts, media, the voting processes, the assaults on those institutions will slowly but surely sap away the very democratic values that we so enjoy and that we so respect and that we want to see succeed. And so it made sense to both pair an analysis, a political analysis on one hand, and then call on theologians to write about a theology of democracy.
Great. Thank you, David, for setting the table for us for this conversation. And we'll come back to you later on for picking up that thread of theology of democracy, looking at the chapter of a Jewish response to nationalism that you wrote. Tobias, I want to bring you in. Your expertise is both sort of German and broader European, but also transatlantic. Curious to hear your insights in terms of this interplay, both in Germany and then more further afield, between religion and populist nationalism.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Judge, for the introduction. It's really great to be back with the Berkeley Center. It still feels like yesterday, given that it was the last thing I was doing before the pandemic, was being there, and I feel like I haven't really done anything since. But yes, I will try to keep it brief and focus my remarks, as you said, on really trying to understand the dynamics in Europe, how right-wing populists reference religion there, and the role of the churches in in reacting to that, because we do indeed see from anti-immigrant protesters in Germany who are displaying oversized crosses through the French Rassemblement National, demanding the display of nativity scenes in public buildings, to Italy's right-wing populist leader Matteo Salvini carrying a rosary during his speeches, that right-wing populists in Europe really are increasingly using Christian language and using Christian symbols in their rhetoric in recent years. But while it may be tempting to, in some ways, take such references as at face value and assume an inherent alliance between Christian faith and right-wing populism, we actually see that a closer analysis of this relationship suggests a much more complicated relationship in many ways, as David already alluded to, and that in fact, in some ways, Western Europe can even be seen as a case study of religion, in some instances even working as a bulwark against the advance of right-wing populism. And to try to better understand that, we basically approached this dynamic in 4 steps. First, by looking at the social origins of right-wing populism, trying to understand where this movement is coming from, or is driving it. Then second, trying to figure out how religion fits into this. What do right-wing populists actually mean when they talk about Christian identity? Third, by trying to see how the strategy works out in practice. How do Christian communities across Europe react to that? And then fourth, what this means for the role of the church in society and of religion in politics and European politics going forward. But first things first, what are the social origins of right-wing populism? And then in a way, here we find something across many countries that is not just in Europe, but also the case in the US, that this rise of right-wing populism in many ways is the consequence of the emergence, what we in some ways call a new identity cleavage, a new cleavage about the question of how do we define the us, how do we define the others, that is much more concerned with issues like immigration, national culture, race relations, national identity, than with traditional economic, social, or moral issues, and then in a way pits 2 visions of how to define the us and the other against one another, with on the one hand a clearly defined idea of a national identity based on inherited group identity markers such as ethnicity, culture, history, and authority, and then on the other hand a much more globalist idea of universalism and diversity that embraces group identities primarily for minorities, but favors much more individualist identities for the majority population. And in some ways, right-wing populists try to politicize this new divide and to capitalize in a way on a crisis of identity that David just described, in a sense of isolation in parts of the majority population. And they're trying to do so through their own brand, in a way, of a right-wing or white identity politics that in a way mirrors but reverses left-wing identity politics by claiming to defend the group rights of the ethnic majority. And it is in the context of this new brand of right-wing identity politics that right-wing populists employ Christianity primarily as a cultural identity marker of the us. So they use Christian symbols, they use Christian language, but do so very often while remaining quite distant from Christian values, beliefs, and institutions. And to try to better understand that, we often said it would be useful to think of the right-wing populist worldview basically as a triangular relationship between, on the one hand, the people, the pure, the good, the homogeneous people, that's the us. And then this us being threatened by a set of 2 others. On the one hand, the corrupted liberal elite, that's probably all of us. And then on the other hand, the external other, the foreigner in many ways. And what is interesting is that in Europe, this external other is increasingly defined in religious terms, and specifically as Islam, or as the Islamic other, and that it is very often only given this religious definition of the other as Islamic that Christianity appears in the rhetoric of these movements as an analogous cultural identifier of the us. But what this is not necessarily a return to religiosity, to the secular politics of Europe, but much more culturalization, perhaps even a secularization of the concept of religion. Religion really here only as a way of identifying the national community, a dissociation of, in a way, of belief and belonging of religion as a faith from religion as a cultural identifier. And it was actually quite interesting that in my own research, I've often seen that under these identitarian references, we often in these movements find quite strong, explicitly anti-Christian currents as well. Now, the question was then, of course, the next question of how this works out in practice. And reactions vary, of course, significantly. We see, of course, in the US, overwhelming support among many white evangelicals for Donald Trump. We see similar developments in parts of Eastern Europe, like Poland. But in Western Europe, we actually see that right-wing populist references are often most successful among irreligious voters or non-practicing cultural Christians, whereas practicing Christians often remain comparatively immune, so that some social scientists even speak of a religious vaccination effect against right-wing populism. That's particularly true in countries like Germany, where, for instance, the AfD scores on average about double as high among irreligious voters than they do among Protestants or Catholics. But we see similar developments in France or Italy, where things such as church attendance are a very strong predictor for not voting right-wing populist parties. And the final point on which I'm going to finish is, of course, trying to understand what determines whether it works as a fuel or as a barrier, religion to right-wing populism. We see two factors that seem to stand out in particular in the context of Europe. First is the behavior of mainstream political parties, and specifically the availability of a Christian alternative, for instance, in the form of a Christian Democratic Party, which might make Christian voters unavailable in many senses for the populist right. But the second and perhaps most overlooked factor behind the religion gap may in fact be the behavior of the institutional churches themselves, the behavior of faith leaders themselves, and their willingness and ability to speak out and to, in some instances, create and maintain social taboos around the populist right. So, for instance, in Germany, the churches have very openly and vehemently spoken out against the populist right. And as a result, we have a lot of evidence showing that they have raised the social costs of association in a way for German Christians with right-wing populist parties, thus contributing in a way to a religious vaccination effect and having the churches seen as defenders of liberal democracy, as we might see it, or of the system churches or the corrupted system, as right-wing populists would put it. Conversely, if faith leaders, for whatever reason, are unable or unwilling to create such taboos, such as the case in Poland, for instance, we see that the vaccination effect appears to break down in many ways. I think I leave it here because I think Colt can talk much more about the theology itself behind that, but that's, so to speak, as a social science perspective from the developments in Europe.
Well, thank you so much, Tobias. And vaccination effect seems like a very apropos term these days. Let's now turn to Colt Anderson for a theological, particularly Roman Catholic perspective on these issues of religion and nationalism. Colt, over to you.
Thanks. So hopefully I don't slow down or have other technical issues too much. The main reason that I was interested in this project is that, I guess, it's personal history on one level. I grew up in the South as a Roman Catholic with a lot of people who really hated Roman Catholics. And so I had a very strong sense of the churches standing up for marginalized communities, because we were marginalized in places like Statesboro, Georgia, back in the 60s and 70s. And so when David came and asked me if I would be willing to participate in a project responding to Catholic nationalism, my first response was, what? Catholic nationalism? That doesn't make any sense. Like, Catholicism is about the whole. And it's about overcoming divisions, and it's about loving your neighbor. And, there are all kinds of documents that say so, which there are, and they're in the book. But like one of them, this is from Gaudium et Spes. Today, there's an inescapable duty to make ourselves the neighbor of every individual without exception, and to take positive steps to help the neighbor whom we encounter. right? And it talks about refugees, and it talks about migrants, and it talks about, all kinds of people who are being discriminated against in different ways. And to see people wrap up Catholicism as a means to attack immigrants and to attack marginalized people really struck me as basically sacrilegious. And that's why I really threw myself into this project, because Catholics have a lot to do with the formation of ethnic nationalism. Because the church's deliberate strategy in the Middle Ages used that as a means to consolidate their power with kings. So you can go to any number of medieval cathedrals and see, the first king of the country being, coronated by some bishop or pope. And, the message is omnipresent that this is a Catholic nation or a Christian nation, given the history, right? It wasn't that distinction. And so there's all of this material in our history that is a result of an effort to evangelize Europe way back, in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. So the church wrapped itself up in all of this ethnic and national imagery in a lot of ways. And it also supported feast days like Our Lady of the Rosary, which, commemorates a defeat of the Turkish, as if the Mother of God is out there killing Turks. They ascribe the victory to Mary, which I think is kind of impious, actually, as a theologian, to think of Mary as, actively involved in warfare. So I recognize that we have all this stuff in our history, and we have these anti-democratic materials too, and some of those have been enforced, like the oath against modernity that seminary professors had to take until 1967. Refers back to, a papal encyclical from 1910 that calls, religious freedom, religious liberty, the wellspring of indifference. So we have all of these pre-Vatican II documents that attack notions of democracy. And we have all of these ethnic and national materials in our history, and yet our church leadership is not responding forcefully to this problem. They'll respond forcefully, to an issue about gay marriage, for example, but they will not respond forcefully to people who are deliberately perverting the Catholic faith to bad political ends. And I think it's because there's a bit of a bifurcation in the Catholic Church. We talk about the visible and the invisible church. And so the church has a political dimension. And it's playing a political role. It's involved in concordats and agreements with Poland and so forth. It gives it certain status, and it wants to maintain that. And at the same time, it wants to maintain, the idea of religious liberty, the UN Charter on Human Rights, and even in Gaudium et Spes, it says that all religions should be treated equally before the law. And at the same time, they do other things. And so what I wanted to do is point out the difference between like these political decisions and historical things and what tradition is, because tradition could be used as a way to kind of clear out, what meets the standard of scripture and tradition, and clear out these feast days that are based on things like defeating the Turks or the Ottomans, and think about like how these liturgies are being used and how the faith is being deployed politically. And one final point. This is sort of related to the issue. It comes up a lot from the other authors. Identity is an issue I've been interested in from a different standpoint, because the bishops, I do a lot of work on preaching. The bishops have promoted this idea of Catholic identity. And as a theologian, I think that's actually somewhat inappropriate. I'm not going to say totally inappropriate, but I believe the faith calls us to identify with Christ, to identify with people, to identify with the minority, with the migrant, with the marginalized, not to some sort of a set identity that can be used to exclude other people. And so I think theologically, there has been a sort of push that has reinforced these nationalist tendencies. I don't think it's always, actually, I don't even think it's normally that this is what the bishops have been intending to do. I think it tends to be a bit of naivete. And with that, I'll close. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Colt, for those remarks. I want to bring David back in for particularly looking at his chapter, a Jewish response to religious nationalism. David.
Post-World War II, there was a lot of self-reflection. The Protestant church has slowly but surely over a number of decades apologized for the Holocaust, apologized for the murder of so many innocent people and not taking a stance. The Catholic Church reached out to the Jewish community, starting with Vatican II, but really along with Pope John Paul II. So there really was a move within these churches to try to reflect on their failure to respond to the assaults on human and civil rights. The reverse is somewhat true within the Jewish community. Theologically, a community or a faith that has been out of power for 2,000 years had to kind of develop a theology of powerlessness, that actually God is on the side of the powerless, not on the side of those who have power. That power is ephemeral. The ultimate power of God, and therefore the defense of the Jewish people, comes from their not having power, so that you can see liturgically over and over again prayers or psalms used or from the medieval period that say, in every generation they've come to destroy us, and God, you have protected us. But what happens when a people that's felt beaten up, and particularly after World War II, actually gain power? And that's the example that takes place in Israel. And here we can see, even at this moment, kind of a split between the diaspora Jewish community that still functions as a minority and the community in Israel, which is the only Jewish majority. And there you have the issues of power. So the right-wing Orthodox Haredi, they're called political parties, are very concerned about maintaining their control of policies having to do with religion. Some of it has to do with marriage or divorce, or whether a bus can ride on the Sabbath. But a lot of it has to do with making sure that their institutions get the money that they need. So their theology kind of takes second place to their assertion of power, or in the case right now, where they've been pushed out of power. That said, the history that Colt talks about, the history of a triumphant church that is conquering the world, the Jewish world is very different. And so it had to develop an alternative. So we see in the Mishnah, in a second century collection of debates, followed up by medieval Maimonides in the 12th century, one of the probably great Jewish architects of Jewish law, says that Jews, you are obligated by law, by God's will, to follow God in caring for the widow, the orphan, the poor. That means that if you see a poor non-Jew, you're obligated to help that poor non-Jew, to feed, to clothe, to provide housing, even to bury in a religious ceremony for a heathen, for a pagan. But you have to help in that because they can't help themselves. So you see this principle develop of we've got to care for the other as well. They still separate Jew to non-Jew. But there is at least this ethos that begins, and it comes from the principle, the biblical principle that we see early on in Genesis, B'Tselem Elohim Nivra Adam, that each human being is created in God's image. And to be being created in God's image, the rabbis tell us in the Talmud and Sanhedrin, they'll say to do that means that, in a parable they use, that each human being has infinite value, demands infinite equality, and we have to respect the infinite uniqueness, that God actually is enlarged, so to speak, when human equality, human uniqueness is valued. That's where you get that line, to save a life is to save the whole world, to take a life is as if you are killing the whole world. And that developed into a second principle, which is, what is the role? What does it mean to walk after God? It means that you do the things that God does. And in this case, not that God is the God of war or the God of destruction, but rather as God heals, as God feeds, as God blesses, so you need to do the same. This notion of partnership with God to repair a broken world. In the liberal progressive community and in the diaspora community, that became fundamental because Jews were in fact engaging others. And you see that very strongly in the religious engagement of Jews around the world. In Israel, it comes in a tension with the nationalist needs of the Jewish majority to assert itself. And there you see secular politicians like Benjamin Netanyahu. Ironically, you see him fomenting violence against the Muslim population and Christian population, demanding that Israel is a Jewish nation and that the Knesset should vote accordingly. And you actually see an Orthodox prime minister now in Bennett saying, hold on, we're working with everyone in the world. We are respecting all diversity. So you see this irony that Tobias pointed out, which is the least religious guy, such as a Benjamin Netanyahu, ends up using religious identity to trounce his opponents. And you see actually much of the non-extreme religious community saying, hold on, that is not what it means to be a Jew today. So this tension is real, and it plays itself out there in one way. That said, where Jews are a minority, it plays itself out in a very different way.
Thank you, David, for those comments and to your co-authors as well. Thank you for your remarks. I want to bring in Jocelyn now as a respondent. Jocelyn, you have researched and written extensively on the area of religion and politics and public life and national identity. So we welcome your reflections on this book.
Thank you, Jude, and thank you to all the panelists. I have to say that I enjoyed the book very much. It's an original book in the sense that it succeeds in bringing different countries, different political experiences, but also different disciplinary approaches, and especially making religious approach a perspective on what's going on now. And it's rare enough to be noted and appreciated. So for the sake of the discussion, I would like to distinguish three levels that I think are present not only in the today talks, but also in the book. There is nation, there is religious nationalism, and then there is populism. And again, for the sake of discussion, I would like to clarify the three. It came very strongly in David, but also called approach that nationalism is bad. I mean, I'm simplifying for the sake of, but I just want to take a more historical approach. Actually, nationalism everywhere was seen as an emancipatory movement. And here I really take seriously the fact that nation is the modern political community. We cannot confuse it with empires, with tribes, with other kind of collective or political groups. Why? Because it's based on two principles: equality of people and sovereignty of people. No other political community are based on this principle. And guess what? It will fly in the face of all religious communities. There is no religious community that is based on equality of people and sovereignty of people. And Colt reminded us very nicely that actually the first religion that had to encounter the rise of this new collectivity was the Catholic Church that was dominating Europe and was the canopy to understand everything, not only the personal life, but also politics, economy. You're born in the church, you died in the church. There was no other alternative. The state will come and with the national community and said, I have now responsibility for people. And you, church, you're going to need to make space. And that's the beginning of the redefinition of religious community because of nation state. But guess what? It didn't happen only to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was the first to experience it. And I don't want to get more into detail, but I was happy to hear David about Judaism. The Jews became emancipated in this new modern collective. And the first movement of the Jews of the Ashkala is to say, oh, we are not anymore a collectivity claiming Zion, the messianistic Zion. We are now all individuals, citizens, and religion becomes our faith. And that's why religion and faith are not the same. Faith reflects the capacity of the believer to maintain the religious prescription and the identification within the boundary of a modern political community that doesn't require allegiance outside. And the Jews had to prove this again and again and again. And so what did Israel, let's jump, Israel comes and is built on a modern vision of Zion that is not the traditional messianistic one brought by Herzl, that applied to the Jews the principle of the modern nation, equality, sovereignty of people. And you can read all the problem of Israel today with the incapacity to bring the two Zions together. But it happened to Muslim countries too. I always shock everybody. But for me, the challenge of Muslim nation countries is exactly the same. They went from Muslim empire, multilinguistic, multi-religious, to nation that had to equate national belonging and religious belonging. So that's one thread, and it's a long historical thread. So nation can be as emancipatory as they can be intolerant. And I think it's important to keep this in mind. Religious nationalism is part of this new modern configuration. And again, religious nationalism can also be emancipatory. In America, America was first a Christian nation. And it was an emancipatory experience. So, that's the difference here. And in Europe, religious nationalism and the rise even of Christian parties between the two world wars, and especially after World War II, were signs that Christianity could be part of this national equalitarian community. And it was positive. And then you have populism. And populism is also related to this modern understanding of politics, but it's not only, and here Tobias, you're absolutely right, it's in Europe, it's seen as what Roger Brubaker called an identity marker. Religion is involved in it as an identity marker to define us versus them, or civilizational approach, Brubaker would say. But I don't think it's the only way. You touched briefly on the US. What strikes me is that the populism in the US that everybody called Christian nationalism, and I'm not convinced about that. They don't want only us without that. They want to change the institution. It's not just that they are happy with the symbolic demarcation. Unlike the populist in Europe, the populists in Europe would be horrified by the political agenda of the populists in America. They don't want to change laws about abortion. They don't want to change the discussion about same-sex marriage. As you said, most of the followers of this movement are actually very secular because they are happy with indeed the religion as an identity marker. But what strikes me is the investment of populists in America to make changes in the politics. And this, again, you can see the same thing, not only in America, but it's happening in India. You can make comparison here with the religious populism in America with the BJP approach that is also mentioned in the book, I would say with the Russian approach to orthodoxy that is also a push to change the political practice and the behavior of citizens. So that's why I think here there are three different entries to the current approach about religion, nation, and populism. And I just want to make sure that we are not all lumping them together. And I will stop here.
Great. Thank you so much, Jocelyn. And let me remind our audience that the Q&A function is working. There's a few good questions there already. So if you would like to ask a question, just click on that Q&A button, type your question as succinctly as you can, and we'll try to get to that. Why don't I start our time of discussion with a question from Father Bruce Neely, and this is probably mostly for Tobias, but I'd like to hear from others. And he asks, can the post-World War II Christian democratic parties, like those in Germany, Italy, and France, serve as models for strengthening democracies today? And maybe to riff on that a bit, David, in your opening remarks, you talked about Orban and his vision of Christian democracy. How do you differentiate the two sort of visions or versions of Christian democracy, and particularly how do you bolster the more traditional post-World War II inclusive vision of Christian democracy? But Tobias, do you want to speak first to, maybe it goes to that vaccination effect comment that you made, but Christian democratic parties as potential models against nationalism?
Yeah, and I think that is actually a very, very interesting question. It builds a bit in a way on what Jocelyn was also mentioning just now on the how Christianity and faith generally, but Christianity in particular in Europe, has trying to come to grasp with modernity, with a nation state, with democracy. And in a way, Christian democracy after the Second World War was in some ways a movement against the church. With the church actually saying, oh no, we have this still separate reality. But it was very often lay people who said, Catholic lay people who said, no, we have to combine these two. And it was an attempt in a way to make democracy safe for Christianity, and to translate in many ways Christian values. This is where the whole idea of Christian values comes from, to translate Christian values into values that are accessible to the whole population, and trying to make it more inclusive, to take almost, if you think about belief and belongings, keep the beliefs, but make the belonging part less exclusive. And I think that was in many ways the idea behind Christian democracy. Of course, like it's not that clear cut, and belonging is still an important part and all of that, but that was a bit the push behind that. If we compare that, it's almost the counter mirror image of what right-wing populists now try to do, who say, like, especially in Europe, we don't really care about the beliefs. Like they're very open about saying, like, we actually don't like the church as an institution. They always talk about refugees. They shouldn't be allowed to talk about that. We actually want a very strict separation. We don't care about gay marriage and these things. And we actually, we don't go to church. We don't believe in God and all of these things. They're very open about that. But Christian identity as a form of Christian heritage, as a form of like being the us and against the other, that we want. So in a way, they take away the Christian beliefs and focus much more on Christian identity. And I think this is a bit and you could see it, really interesting debates in Europe at the moment, because you have these Christian democratic governments, like in Germany, like parties in Germany, in Italy, etc. And then you have Viktor Orban talking about Christian democracy, and they were saying, no, you are not Christian democracy. And it's two very different. Christian democracy 2.0, but it's quite clear, and you actually have a quite big confrontation between the two at the moment. And Viktor Orban has been asked to leave the traditional Christian Democratic Party grouping in Europe.
Thank you, Tobias. David or Colt, you want to jump in on that question?
I found Jocelyn horribly depressing, because she truly uncovered a truth that for liberal democracy post-World War II tried to merge three different understandings of democracy. One was populist, that majority rules, period. The majority has a right to rule. That's very continental politics, political theory. The second is the British and American version, which is, no, it's actually individual rights that matter. And so in the United States, you get the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. But the principle that came in and exists in Anglo countries, or has existed, is real democracy is about protecting individual rights. And then we have this third notion that democracy is about defending the culture of the nation, that a nation, and you hear that a little bit in Orban, right? That a nation has a right to say, this is who we are. We are, whether or not we believe, we descend from this Christian tradition or this Muslim tradition or this Hindu tradition. And these others are not really authentic to our nation. Liberal democracy thought it could pull off melding these three together: popular democratic rule of the majority, protection of individual rights, and holding on to the cultural integrity upon which the country was founded. And what Jocelyn said carefully, and she didn't take it to the real point that I'm sure she could have, is it may be untenable. We may be in a situation where what liberal, and this is the scary part for me, because I can't reconcile this, that liberal democracy can't contain this. It simply cannot merge these three. And what we are seeing now is the explosion in a variety of ways, the explosion or the demise of this triad notion of democracy. And for me, it's very scary because I don't know how to reconcile it, because I really understand the people who say, wait, I don't want burqas in my country. That is not the values of my country. And I really understand those who say the majority has a right to determine what should be true in our nation. And I really, of course, admire those who say we have to protect individual rights. So I really don't know how this can reconcile. And Jocelyn, that was mean of you but you did it with such, excellent, careful descriptions. I really respect and appreciate it, but you left me terrified.
That was not my intention, really. You are putting back together what I was trying to differentiate, but I understand what you are coming from. Yeah.
Thank you. Cole, do you want to speak to this Christian democracy question? I also have another question from an audience member for you after that.
Yeah, I just want to be fairly brief about it. I do want to say that I don't think nationalism, as a historian, like I'm not saying that what the church did in France, when the country was becoming a Christian country is a bad thing. Nor do I want to say that liberation movements of different kinds, like the Solidarity movement, are bad things, because those are liberation movements as well. And when we were writing this book, I think we were really thinking about the kind of way nationalism is being expressed today. At least that's what I was thinking about. And, one of the things I would want to point out is that, these ideas, and in the Catholic Church, part of the problem is we have a lot of these, I think these past documents are part of the problem. I think you can look at something like Bill Barr's speech at Notre Dame, and you can see that, there's a lot of reference to pre-Vatican II papal encyclicals and whatnot, at least in the thinking of it. I mean, not that he's citing them exactly. And so what we see is that people are trying to pull these pieces out of like Christian history and present them as if they're doctrine. And we haven't really taught Catholics very much how to distinguish that much between these different kinds of sources. And I taught in seminaries for years and had men come in and, these are the most devout people coming into seminaries and they don't know those distinctions. What's the difference between, something that's a tradition and binding and what's something that's just custom, or what's something that's, has a lower level of authority. There's a whole way of thinking in theology about different levels of authority for different statements, and we don't share it. And then just one quick remark I would like to make is that we have a ton of material that does support liberal democracy. Certainly in the Vatican II documents, which are authoritative, we have materials that support liberal democracy. And that is part of that movement. After World War II, there was a movement, and I would like to say that Catholics in America had a lot to do with that movement towards respecting, religious liberty. Because in our experience in this country, our history was that allowed us to flourish. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thanks, Colt. In your opening remarks, you mentioned that the Catholic leadership in the States is more likely to speak out on some social issues as opposed to the perhaps misuse of Catholic theology or identity in sort of politically corrosive ways. Question on that front from Nicholas Troilo. He says, isn't the problem in the US the conservative programs of the US Conference of Catholic Bishops and how they lead to support for right-wing populism among Roman Catholics? And two, for other panelists, I wonder if there's an analogous dynamic where you do have some areas of alignment, perhaps on social issues, that then lead to this broader coalition between nationalists and religious voters.
You know, I would say that is pretty true. I mean, one of the problems is that a few bishops sign some document, like the one against gay marriage that I cite in the book, right? They don't know that they're signing on with all of these really pretty right-wing pastors from these very right-wing groups, and that it's going to be picked up by, you know, like Steve Bannon types. I don't know. I guess we don't use alt-right anymore because we started, you know, using alt-right language when we were writing, and then that language shifted a bit. But, you know, then you begin to see how this stuff morphs into a way to call people to vote for Republican Party, and not just any Republican Party, but for, you know, Trump and for the Trump agenda. And because if you don't do this, then marriage is threatened, and then all of your religious liberties are threatened. So, I mean, that's what this letter said. And the fact that some bishops, as official representatives of the USCCB, signed it, then allowed these right-wing people to try to incorporate as many Catholics as they could over to their agenda. And it's a huge problem. And it's been a problem for years. When I started, one of the reasons David got me involved is I used to work with the Interfaith Alliance. And I used to be a consultant to the Democratic Party as to how to respond to the religious right, because the religious right began to try to, you know, incorporate Catholics into their movement. And so this has been going on consciously on the part of very, very conservative nationalist people in this country for at least 30 years.
Thanks, Colt. Others want to speak to analogous dynamics within other countries or other religious movements where you have alignment on certain issues that then leads to this broader coalition.
In a lot of the other places, frankly, there isn't the dynamic you have in the United States. In India, it is Hindus and Muslims. Granted, there are other smaller groups, but the Hindu goal now of BJP is to eradicate the memory of Muslim presence in India. In Indonesia, the Christian mayor of Jakarta is jailed for blasphemy. The last synagogue was taken down, again, eradicating the memory. You're seeing that in Myanmar with Buddhists, basically eradicating the presence of Muslims, in this case, Muslims in Myanmar. And in Israel, you see the law of the Jewish, that Israel is Jewish, but also literally taking down the physical places where Muslims lived, where the minarets were. So what we are seeing around the world is the hope of using, it's not so much fusing in the other countries because they have one single religion that is the most powerful. And their goal there, they can simply eradicate even the right-wing Muslims, right, that may be in India, or in theory, right-wing, we're seeing a little bit strange, right-wing Muslim in Israel that could be part of the government. But on the whole, the goal of those nations is to eradicate the memory or the presence, whether historical or not, the presence of the other. Oh, by the way, let me add Poland, where they passed legislation to make sure that Poland has no liability for the death of any Jews in the Holocaust. So we really see, it's almost like this boomerang from the principles of the United Nations forming in 1948, so 47, 48, 49, during that period, the the universal laws passed on human rights and religious rights. And we see almost a boomerang effect taking place across the world now. There is simply no religious community, faith community, that does not have some element of that faith community engaged in this type of, well, I'm saying where populism, nationalism, and religious identity fuse, where religious identity is being used to fuel the populist nationalist revolts.
Thanks, David. Tobias, you wanted to come in on that?
Yeah, very briefly, and just to support that in a way, I think one of the reasons why we wrote this book and what was important to us was to that often in the media, like particularly in the US, but also in Europe, we have this narrative of like just identifying Christianity, particularly conservative Christianity, with like far right nationalism, and you just think it's like one and the same thing. And I think one of the interesting findings that if you look a bit more closely is that actually we have two right-wing movements, and we see that very clearly in Europe, but I think we can also observe it to an extent in the US, between on the one hand, a traditional conservative Christian right that really focuses on a lot of these like social and moral issues. And then and that is actually also like in terms of demographics very different, because these people often tend to be church going, often older, in Europe also often better educated and wealthier. And then you have a new, much more secular right, what some people might call the alt-right, that is much less focused on these traditional moral or sexual moralities issues, but much more focused on these identitarian issues. And this is much more often the white working class, which actually is, if you look at the data, the most rapidly secularizing part, not just in Europe, but also of the American population. And it is in many ways the representatives, right-wing populists represent often more this new secular right. And then the question is to an extent whether these two go into alliance or not. And what we're seeing in the US is that for the reasons that the populist right does not care that much about sexual morality, but is happy to align with that, and for a perceived lack of alternatives, many conservative Christians say like, it's the smaller of two evils. We can take that. We can ally ourselves with that, and we won't confront it. Whereas in Europe, the churches and the Christian, because there is Christian democracy, have said no. That is a movement that we don't align with. We are different from that in terms of socio-demographic terms, but also we are different that in terms of values. And there's just a much stronger focus on issues like the clashes on identity issues such as immigration, etc. These clashes are also there in the US, but it's a bit the question of where the churches position themselves, which questions they focus on, and whether there's an alternative. And in Europe, the focus is just much more on these identitarian issues where you clash, whereas in the US, I think the focus is much more on the sexual morality or like more broadly religious freedom issues where you might have alignment. But I think it's still important to recognize that these are two different movements, both in terms of ideology, political structure, and grassroots that are driving them. Thank you so much, Tobias. We have some other fantastic questions in the Q&A, but we're coming close to our 1 hour mark, and I'm concerned that we would go over if we were to fully address the questions that are here. Jocelyn, I wonder if I could bring you in here at the end in response to what our panelists have said, or some of the questions that have been posed to them. Any final thoughts from you before I conclude our time together?
In 1 minute, if I may, what I hear is that we need to broaden up our questions on nation, populism, and religion beyond the West. The example of India came up, the example of Israel came up. When I hear all these distinctions, the people who are populist, they are not really religious. It reminds me the discussion we have in Islam, in political Islam, distinguishing the movement that fight for a new political community in the name of Islam from the people who are faith-driven or believers. And you know, the more I've been working, the more I think the thing we have been calling Islamism for decades, maybe it's just Islamic populism, and some people are turning this way. So this is interesting because it comes from this cross-pollination between current discussion about the role of religion in Europe or the US, toward looking also differently at what has been happening in Muslim majority countries for a long, long time. So I would say more comparison here is needed.
Very good. Thank you so much, Jocelyn, for that final word, which leads on to future books and webinars and research projects very nicely. But for now, we'll need to conclude our webinar at the 1 hour mark. If you looked at the chat, there was a link to where you can buy the book. We were told that the promo code was no longer active. Maybe we can try to find another promo code to encourage you to buy the book, but I would highly recommend it, having read it myself. Thank you, David and Tobias and Colt, for joining us. Again, thank you for all the work you put into producing the book. And Jocelyn, thanks for joining us and sharing your insights as well. Thanks to our audience for engaging with us. Thanks to my colleagues at the Berkeley Center for making this webinar possible. Again, it was recorded and the recording will be posted on our website within the next few days. Thank you so much.